everybody. This is Matt Anderson from The Road Rarely Taken, and welcome to today's podcast. And my guest today is Don Sandel, and he is the founder of Go Positive. He's been leading talent development efforts for small and large organizations for the last few decades, and has transitioned those skills and experience into his current company, Go Positive. He began studying the brain and its effects on learning about a decade ago, discovered compelling and irrefutable research around positivity, and made the comment, I researched how positivity impacted learning and development, literally enabled the brain to learn more effectively, and was immediately hooked. Empowered by the neuroscience that supports positive psychology, Don has created a program called Positive Performance for a large pharmaceutical company to huge success. And so not long after that, he was presenting and keynoting at conferences around the globe. Quote, this is a lifestyle dedicated to improving employee and organization performance through science. Don is a dynamic presenter, a self-proclaimed pathological extrovert, and brings a fun and irreverent brand of humor to all his engagements. So hopefully we'll get a few chuckles in the next hour. Don, thanks so much for joining us.
Good to see you, Matt. Happy to be here.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So my first kickoff question is around getting out of your own way, since that's sort of the focus topic for those people familiar with the podcast. And so that question is, if you had to pick one thing that's perhaps helped you the most in terms of getting out of your own way, what would you say that is?
Yeah, we have an infinite ability to fool ourselves, right? We give ourselves our own feedback, and it goes through our own filters and our own experiences. And I found one of the biggest things that helped me, and I think it's going to help other people, is being open to other people's feedback. We see the world through our own kind of rose-colored glasses, and we have our own opinions based on our experiences. And lots of times our opinions are wrong. How we view a situation, how we view ourselves, it's just plain wrong because it's colored through our filters. Mm-hmm. So how do we see the world uncolored? And part of that is really being open to other people's feedback. And creating a environment where people feel safe to give you feedback. Those are all data points that can help you realize, you know what, the way I saw that situation, it wasn't reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's funny because you talked about being open to the feedback, because when the first time I wrote that down and you said it, my first thought is even, because I just met with someone today and I was telling them about the last business I ran, well, one of the last businesses I ran that failed. And even because he asked me if I did research beforehand on whether there was a market for it. And I said, I think one of the mistakes I made is, yes, on paper, yes, I surveyed a bunch of people. But I also think that I part of my problem was I only chose to hear the bits that supported what I was looking to hear.
Yeah.
And somehow filtered out or chose not to hear the bits where they didn't actually say, yes, I would pay that much for that service. So that's my only question about what you just said is or maybe the question is how do you get people to be, well, okay, so you said put them in an environment where they feel safe, but I think people don't my experience is people need some education also, or more, we all need more education on understanding the piece you went on to say about how everything we see is colored through filters, and I don't think most people realize that. I think most people think that the way they see the world is the way the world is. So how do you address that topic?
Yeah, we don't challenge our biases enough. We don't challenge our own beliefs enough. And we have to kind of strengthen that muscle that says, I'm going to challenge my beliefs. Every single day, I'm going to ask that question, okay, am I seeing this the way that it really is? And then when people give us feedback, obviously be open to it, probe a little bit further, and encourage them, okay, thank you very much. Keep giving me that feedback. Mm-hmm. Now, sometimes we're still going to have our biases. If we have a brain, we have a bias, right? But it is that idea of being open to it and then probing a little bit further. Okay, thank you very much. Give me some more. That helped.
And okay, so then my next thought is, and I don't know why my brain's wired this way, to sort of think and put myself in the shoes of, well, why that would be challenging. So then I'm thinking about another comment that this guy that I met earlier to mention was just how time pressed people are. Because it's, I can see that if I took the time to do this, then yes, that would be great. So again, when you work with groups, how do you get that ball rolling so that they do take the time to challenge their beliefs and biases? Or is there an exercise?
You know, when I come into organizations, I'm whether it's the workshop itself or the keynote or the coaching, or if it's before that and it's during the sales process where I'm sitting down with executives. Mm-hmm. There is a natural skepticism because Don's kind of the happiness guy. I talk about happiness, optimism, and positivity, or what we call HOP. And there's some skepticism around that. Really, you're going to come into our organization and we're going to use loaded words like happiness. So one of the things that I do to get that buy-in, Matt, is I spend a little bit of time talking about the neuroscience, right? And talking about we are different and we are better when we're happy, optimistic, and positive. Now, so many people know that from their own experience, right? But research has told us over the last 25 years that is irrefutable. That is absolutely the case. Mm-hmm. And it's not just a social virtue. The brain changes. The chemicals in the brain, in the gut, literally change, and that is part and parcel what makes us different and better. We get a release of certain neurochemicals when we're happy, when we're optimistic, when we're positive. And it is part and parcel those neurochemicals that make us different and better. So when I spend a little bit of time talking about that and saying, look, the brain literally changes. It's not a social virtue. This is about the physiology of the body, physiology of the brain. We're different and better. They get it. They understand it. So part of helping that transition from skepticism to belief and to buy-in is really getting into the brain, getting into the neuroscience. And not only do they understand that, but then they go, I've experienced that in my own life.
Mm-hmm. And that makes sense to help people, put themselves in their own shoes and remember, I was life was a lot better, or when I was feeling that way. So talk about, the process for those people that are more hardwired to be subpar, happiness, optimism, and positivity, or maybe that's just where they are at the moment. Can you talk about the process of helping people sort of move beyond that, or move towards the happiness, optimism, and positivity? Because knowledge is not going to be, it's not the answer, right? I could see it being the starting point.
Yeah.
If somebody wants to move towards more happiness, optimism, and positivity, I understand, I get the piece that it can be explained and we get it because we've all had those experiences. But to become more of that type of person, can you talk about some of the things involved with doing that?
Yeah, great question. So part of it is that it's very natural for people not to default to being positive, for instance, right? It's not a natural default for most people. Mm-hmm. Most of us are genetically predisposed to have a negativity bias, right? If you think about early humankind was always scanning for what? Was always scanning for danger. It was better to miss lunch than be lunch. So early humankind was always scanning for danger, and that part of our brain really hasn't changed. We still have that negativity bias. The focus of the brain is about our survival, not our life satisfaction. So we have to counter that negativity bias, right? We have to understand that we have that, and that is a habit that we have this negativity bias. And we need to choose to have a positivity bias. We need to choose to default to being happy, optimistic, and positive. And we do a number of exercises, a number of activities in the workshop where we get people to, one, be more self-aware, right? Let's start with that. Emotional intelligence. We're going to start with being more self-aware. We're going to start with self-regulating. We're going to start with this concept of metacognition, the fact that we can think about our thinking. Animals can't do that, but we can do that. Mm-hmm. So we catch ourselves in negative thought. We catch ourselves ruminating, right? And then when we catch ourselves and we're more self-aware, how do we reframe that? So we do a whole segment on this idea of reframing, right? So I'm driving to work and I'm in traffic and I'm running late. So my limbic system takes over and I get emotional and I get excited and I get frustrated and I get anger. Well, what good is that doing you? How is that serving you?
Yeah.
So we have to be self-aware, catch ourselves ruminating, and then reframe that to the positive.
And I'm curious, I mean, in terms of the best success stories you've seen in your life, and I'm being that broad because I don't know all the context of how you've worked with people in the past specifically. You know, what's going through my brain as you talk about these things are things that, well, I'm thinking, well, obviously, you know, people need to turn these into sort of more habitual ways of being and doing. And, you know, obviously that can't be done in a workshop. So what have you seen, or what do you recommend for people to sort of do so that it becomes more of a habit, such that they can start to literally rewire their brains? That's my language, but, you know, sort of leverage that brain plasticity and shift how they see the world and behave.
Yeah, one is that metacognition, that being self-aware, right? So I'm ruminating, I'm negative, so I'm going to reframe. Some of the activities, though, that we talk about, one sounds really ethereal, but it's we call it the gratitude exercise. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of research lately about gratitude. Mm-hmm. And when you bring that up in a corporate setting, they go, really, that's going to be one of our solutions? But this is what happens. We have a negativity bias. And if we do the gratitude exercise 3 or 4 times a week, now dosage is important, right? Just like pharmaceuticals, dosage is important. If we give thanks and are grateful and do that every day, all the time, we're not going to stick to it. We're going to get bored with it. It's going to become rote. So that's why the research tells us that if we do that every single day, people aren't going to stick with it. But if you do give thanks and gratitude multiple times a week, not multiple times a day, what happens is that if you do that for about a month, so you say you do it Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and maybe you do it on Sunday, what happens is you start to create a new habit. You start to create a new neural map in your brain about this idea of being thankful, looking for good things, looking for the positive. So again, it starts as this social virtue. It starts as this kind of ethereal concept. But literally what happens inside the brain is the brain goes, oh, I see what you're doing. You want me to think more positively. You want me to look for more positive things. You want me to find the good. And eventually you've created that new muscle, or from a physiological perspective in your brain, you've created a new neural map where your neurons are firing and they're actually starting to look for the good.
Yeah.
So if we do that enough, that muscle takes over and that habit starts to form.
So I've got to ask this, I guess, you know, what got you started on this? I mean, forgive me now, because I probably shouldn't say it. I'm assuming you were presumably not in the best place on the planet, or you came across some of the research and just, it seems potentially transformative. Has that been your own journey, or were you already an upbeat person that discovered how much you could help other people? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's actually more the latter. Huh. But this is how it began. It was pure serendipity. I was in the corporate world for 26 years. And I was leadership development, executive coaching, talent development. And I was trying to get at the very core to understand how we learn so that I could create leadership development curriculum better. So how do people learn? So once I understood that, and I got to things like the brain, got to the neuroscience, and understood that learning occurs, you know, in the hippocampus and things like that. So I started to do that research. But, you know, Matt, as I started to do that research, I kept running into research around positive psychology. And I kept running into it. It was serendipity, and I kept running into it. And it wasn't long before I transitioned from how do we learn and how does the brain learn to this positive psychology stuff, this research. this is really profound. And I think this can help people and teams and organizations and leaders.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened is I transitioned that study all to the positive psychology. Stayed with the brain, stayed with the neuroscience. How does the physiology of the brain change when we're happy, optimistic, and positive? And before you know it, what happened is I was in a large pharma company, created a workshop that, if you will, went viral. There was a wait list to get into the workshop. Before you know it, people were pulling me in to speak at internal conferences. Then people were pulling me to speak at external conferences. Mm-hmm. And before you know it, this business just kind of serendipity emerged. But I'll add this, and this is a little bit to your point, Matt, that also during this time, I was one of those people that was a workaholic, mm-hmm. working easy 65, 75-hour weeks, taking side projects, still publishing, still doing coaching on the side. And I couldn't sustain that. And I realized that the solution was right in front of me, that I had to shift my mindset and that what I was doing wasn't that healthy. So I applied these concepts that I was teaching and coaching to other people to my own life. And since I've been doing this, I haven't been sick once. I haven't been sick once. And before I really started this, and
Don, your screen is frozen. So 3, 2, 1. So Don, you talked about applying how some of the mind. I'll do it again. So 3, 2, 1. So Don, you talked about how you applied some of the concepts from your research. I guess applied them to yourself. Which ones in particular were most helpful?
You know, one of the things that was the most profound was that, you know, again, I was in the corporate world for a quarter century. That's a bit difficult to say, but I was in the corporate world for a quarter century, and I had kind of been there, done that, and had put in the long, long hours. And I realized that, you know, we go through this trip of life but once. And I didn't want to spend my whole life working. I enjoyed the work. I loved the work. I loved the organization, loved the people. But man, that 65 to 75 hours a week was really beating me up, making me sick, etc. And I said, you know, I need to apply what it is that I teach and what it is that I coach to other people. And one of the things that I would give somebody feedback that was in my situation is, how can you turn that around? If you're doing 80% of work that really isn't thrilling you anymore, and you're doing about 20% of the stuff that you really love, well, how can you leverage that strength? How can you do more of the stuff that you really love? And that began, Matt, about a year-long pursuit of, how can I really focus on my strengths? Mm-hmm. How can I do the stuff that I really love? I'll figure out how to monetize it, but how can I make that transition? And I think if more people realize that they have a choice, mm-hmm. right? They have a choice to be happy. They have a choice in what they do, that they'll lead a much more thriving and flourishing life. So I ended up, in about a year's time, leaving the organization and switching that percentage, doing 80% of the stuff that I really love, and 20% of the stuff, well, you just got to do it.
So Don, and please answer this as honestly, really honestly. I mean, is it as simple as you asked yourself a better question about, like, it's how do I do more of what I love? I mean, was that what helped you significantly? Was just giving your brain better questions that expected a better answer, or was there a lot more to it than that helped you kind of turn things around? Was there a lot of pain about working too much as well?
Well, I think you become more open to some of those questions when the pain is as rough as it was. Okay. So that question really was the genesis for, let's lead a life where I'm loving my work and I'm loving my life and I'm thriving and I'm flourishing.
I like that. That's much more real, believable. Because I mean, I had a vaguely similar experience 15 months ago where somebody asked me, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? And again, Genesis is a great word because it got me on a different path, but there was no, I mean, it was months before I made perhaps big decisions. I'm also curious if, was anybody else involved in your turn, that shift? In other words, was there somebody like a friend that sort of got in your face and said, Don, you just seem like you're working too much and it's not good for you? Was there any of that, or was this all kind of something you did on your own?
Not that I did not share this with loved ones and those close to me. Obviously, my life partner, my wife, I had that conversation with her. With my two sons, Matt and Mark, I had the conversation with them. Quite frankly, outside of that group, I wasn't too worried about anybody else's input, anybody else's opinion. Making such a change from this existence in the corporate world to going out and being an entrepreneur, that was really, really some close family discussions. And the beauty was, even though my kids were all in right away, and my wife, God bless her, is very risk averse, but even she saw how healthy this would be and has been completely behind this.
Oh, that's awesome. Not relevant really, but I'm just curious, how old were your boys at the time?
Well, when we had this discussion, it was just 3 years ago, so they were in their low 20s.
Got it. Okay. All right. So 2 questions based on things we've already discussed that I'm itching to ask. The first one is, a short while ago, you said the workshop went viral, and I'm curious as to the reasons behind that. I mean, I'm sure, yes, it was innovative and entertaining and engaging, and you're a great presenter and things like that. But I'm curious, I mean, as best you can, putting yourself in the shoes of other people, what do you think resonated or appealed about it such that it went viral?
Well, one, I think, the Dalai Lama says that our reason for living is to be happy. Mm. And this is integral to our life and our work, right? Nobody said that this needs to be working in the sulfur mines or working in the coal mines, right? That's not the way life should be. So I think when we talk about how happiness, optimism, positivity links to higher performance, there is a very natural desire to learn more and get to that thriving life that, as the Dalai Lama says, so many of us are indeed pursuing. Mm-hmm. The thing that really works, though, is not only do we go into the business impact of this approach, right? We're better in every domain of our life when we're happy, optimistic, and positive. And that includes work, mm-hmm. right? We are more focused, more disciplined, more innovative, more creative. We're actually smarter when we have a mindset that is happy, optimistic, and positive. In fact, Matt, you'll appreciate this. They've done multiple duplicated studies, and they prime students to be happy before taking math achievement tests. They prime them to be happy, neutral, or negative before taking math achievement tests. The ones that were primed to be happy almost always did better, mm-hmm. right? We have better memories, we have better recall, we're better able to leverage the power of our own brain, and we open up the learning centers of our brain when we have this mindset. So people grab a hold of it and go, wait, hold it. If I have this mindset that is good for me, and it helps me be smarter, and it helps me have a better memory, it helps me build relationships, why on earth would I not do this? So I think it really resonated with people from a life perspective, but then when we get into the business impact, they realize where it fits with their own performance, the performance of their teams, and can I lead as a positive leader? It just resonated, and there is a wait list for the workshops, and people found it really having impact in their performance.
That makes sense. So in other words, is it fair to say then that people recognized it would actually make them better at what they did, and it would have other benefits in their own personal lives? Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
In fact, I have so many stories, and this is what motivates me. I have so many stories of people who've written me, sent me emails, called me, talked to me after a keynote or after a workshop. and talked about how the timing of this was perfect in their life because they were wrestling with this, or they're dealing with that, or they're also putting in 75-hour weeks, and that this was exactly what they needed to get on the right track.
Yeah. I mean, I'm barely surprised that, I mean, I kind of feel like we live in a workaholic nation, and although it's not exclusive to the US, I think it's becoming more and more common in Western cultures in general, as people feel like they're busier and busier. And well, anyway, it's a different direction I could start going in, but I'm not surprised that many people, that your message resonated with them, because I could see a lot of people feeling that way. So I want to ask you about visualization and sort of influencing the subconscious mind. I don't know if you ever talk about things in those terms, but I'm thinking in terms of sustainable habits for people listening. I can see a gratitude practice being invaluable. And I'm curious about other things, but I personally want to ask you about visualization, because I could see that also, impacting our brains. What's your, I don't know, take on that subject?
Well, let me take that and just move it slightly, okay? Yeah. Because remember, we talked about we have this negativity bias, and if we're going to lead a positive life, we have to default to the positive, not to the negative. And our brains want to default to the negative. So again, we do things like the reframing, we do things like the gratitude exercise, and our brain starts to unconsciously shift to a positive default. One of the things that I do is I talk about this concept of savoring, right? Because we have this negative default. So when something positive happens in our life, the brain says, unless it's really emotional, the brain says, I'm not going to store that into long-term memory. I don't have the room. Okay. Well, but when something negative happens, the brain says, oh, I can learn from that. I'm going to hold on to that. Mm-hmm. So we need to hold on to those positive things that happen more. We need to savor those positive moments, mm-hmm. right? And again, that word savor is kind of ethereal, and people might think that that's really a social virtue or something that's soft. But if it's about creating a new neural structure in our brain, just like gratitude exercise is, it's literally creating a new neural structure in our brain, then we need to counter that brain that says, I'm not going to hold on to the positive events. I'm going to just hold on to the negative events because I'm built for your safety, right? Your survival. So we do a savoring exercise, which is probably very similar to the visualization, right? We want to savor these positive moments. So one of the things that we do, and one of the things that we encourage, is just a brief savoring exercise. So Matt, let's do the savoring exercise really quick. What in 2019 was something that was really awesome that happened to you? Something great that happened to you or somebody in your family? And it could be as simple as we all went out to dinner and we had this incredible meal. Mm-hmm. What was something that you or your family experienced that was just really awesome?
With the family? I'm trying to think. Well, I mean, a couple of weeks ago, we were in Mexico and we had a couple of celebration meals while we were out by the Pacific Ocean. So that was pretty cool.
Good. You guys went on vacation. Family was together. So the brain says, good, glad that happened, but I'm not going to store that into memory. Gone. Yes. Right. So one of the things that we encourage people to do more often, even as simple as a meal, either as simple as a great conversation they had with somebody that they care about, mm-hmm. savor that. Mm-hmm. Right? So we start to create that neural structure that holds on to these positive moments longer.
All right. So perhaps more challenging questions. A few minutes ago, you said something about you have a choice to be happy. I'm sure there are people listening that sounds almost a bewildering comment, as if, is it that straightforward? Can you elaborate on that topic, happiness being a choice?
Yeah, we wake up first thing in the morning and we have a choice. What kind of day are we going to make it, right? So it's raining outside and all of a sudden we've decided, oh my gosh, this is going to be a horrible day. Well, you could choose that if you wish. But don't we have that moment? Viktor Frankl talks about that that space in between stimulus and response. And in that space between stimulus and response, we have a choice. And it is that moment of choice that determines our happiness. I wasn't it wasn't a perfect quote of Viktor Frankl, but that was basically the concept. He says we have that choice between stimulus and response. So that's the same thing as choosing to be happy. Now, I motivate people to choose to be happy, again, over and above just the social virtue. There are physiological reasons why when we are happy, optimistic, and positive, we're also healthier, right? We get a release of neurochemicals. We have a stronger immune system. We're healthier. We lead longer lives. They did a study, and it's called the Nun Study. And they went and looked at the writings of young women who wanted to become nuns. And they put them into 4 distinct piles, their writing. Really happy nuns, somewhat unhappy nuns, and really unhappy nuns. Then the researchers traced the lives of these nuns to their totality. And they looked at the lives of these nuns. And the happiest nuns lived the longer lives, lived the healthier lives, lived the happier lives, and were the most successful in their careers. So it's not just a social virtue, but we are different and better because of this.
Yeah, and I mean, I have read a lot on the topic too, and I think I've read about that. I know you're also not, I mean, that's an example, but I know there are many studies you could cite too, because I know there's not an anecdotal example, or is an anecdotal example, but I know it's been replicated many times in different places with different types of people. So I'm glad you shared that. So another slightly different topic, not a different topic. So what about the fake it till you make it approach? And don't assume I have a strong stand on that topic, because I actually don't. But where I'm coming from is I'm thinking of the person that currently is in a mild funk, wants to do better professionally, or grow their business more, but knows that they can't. Well, in their mind, probably doesn't think they can flick a switch and say, okay, well, I'm just going to be this fake zippity doodah happy go lucky person. Or I can't do that much. But what can you talk about? I don't know, putting on a certain face in terms of kind of becoming, like, I don't know, acting more like the person you want to become, even though you're not there yet. Can you talk about that concept?
Well, yeah, and I absolutely would subscribe to that, because I think you're going to see the upward spiral start to be created as opposed to the downward spiral. So what's the alternative? If I'm not going to choose to be happy, well, what's the alternative? Well, you create a downward spiral, right? So what we're talking about is creating an upward spiral, that if you do put on that happy face and you say, I'm going to charge into each day being really optimistic and thinking positively about the future, right? You start to see some physiological difference. You'll start to see differences in your relationships. You'll start to see some differences in some of your work outcomes. So when we have this mindset, we're different and better. And part of it is a physiological one, but there's also this social currency that we start to develop. Think about your own life. Do you want to hang out with somebody who's really negative, or do you want to hang out with somebody who's really positive?
Yeah.
We also talk about this statistic that optimistic salespeople outsell their pessimistic counterparts by 56%. Well, why is that? Well, it's their approach, their ability to network, their ability to look at each day and say, I'm going to take some positive action, and that they build this network and these relationships, and it creates an upward spiral. That's why it happens. That's why that statistic is real. So I would encourage somebody to say, okay, if you want to put it in those terms of fake it till you make it, okay, put it in those terms. But ultimately what you're doing is you're starting to create new habits. You're starting to create that upward spiral.
So how do you phrase that then? Do you use that expression, or do you word it differently when you introduce the upward spiral concept?
Well, I've just started my first book, and it's called Dancing Atop. It's called Dancing Atop the Upward Spiral. So I tend to talk about this concept of, well, where do we begin the upward spiral? We begin it right now. We begin it right now with our attitude, and we have to choose our attitude, right? So every day we wake up and we choose, well, what's going to be my attitude? It's raining outside. Well, so what? There's traffic. So what? I'm going to choose my attitude. I'm not going to have other people choose it for me.
Yeah. It's very interesting you're talking about these things on every level, but two things you've said in the last 2 or 3 minutes that hit me hard because I've heard them so often in these interviews. The first one was around peer group. I mean, it's astonishing to me how often the person I've interviewed has made a comment about who they surround themselves with and how they needed to elevate and change that group because of its influence. And I think it's one of those things, I think most people have heard of it, the concept, but to actually like look hard at the people that surround us and really ask ourselves honest questions, like what positive and negative things are going on with that person that might be affecting me or influencing me more than I realize. You kicked off by saying how unaware we are, or how we can fool ourselves with different things like that. But then the second thing is this choosing your attitude piece that kind of hits me, or actually what hits me most is so many, if not all of the people I've interviewed, they adopt a different mindset or way of looking at sometimes unbelievably traumatic events even. Like for example, one guy interviewed, his wife died unexpectedly, and it actually blew my mind how quickly he was able to see it in an empowered way. I'm sure he grieved greatly because it was pretty unexpected. It wasn't like she had cancer. But it was another reminder about choosing a way to approach a situation in a way that helped him become a stronger person, really rather quickly, actually. So
Yeah.
moving forward, but I don't know, it's quite rare. And maybe that's where my question is in other words, is it very rare for people to be able to do that?
Yeah, I think it is because remember, we have that negativity bias. So our natural inclination is to focus on the negative.
Yeah.
And they've done some really interesting studies about people responding to trauma and tragedy. And one, and there's some really interesting studies around PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder, and some studies around what they call PTG, post-traumatic growth. Why is it that some people come back from a tragedy and they turn it into triumph? Why is it? And what's that common denominator between the people who have PTG, post-traumatic growth? And one of the things that they determined, Matt, was that they already began with that mindset that you spoke of. They began with that mindset that was already there, that was kind of that happy, optimistic, and positive mindset, such that when stress and trauma and tragedy hit, they already had that set foundation that allowed them to grow from the tragedy or the trauma versus have it take them down that downward spiral.
You're going to hate me for saying this. Okay, so firstly, on one level, yes, I've heard about that. And somebody did talk, it's funny, a different person I interviewed who lost her husband suddenly in a plane crash. She talked about this post-traumatic growth syndrome, which I'd never heard of. And then the piece about, that some people have a set mindset that's positive or that's healthy, such that when trauma comes along, they're able to bounce to it. But here's where my brain then went, because I thought of a couple of people like that, but then I thought of someone whose book I read earlier this year, David Goggins' book, Can't Hurt Me, who went through just, absurd amounts of childhood trauma, brutal stuff, and has just accomplished, it's an astonishing read in terms of what he's done physically with his body and his accomplishments. And I'm thinking, and I'm struggling to. There's nothing in the book, certainly in his story anyway, where he suggested that he had any kind of positive mindset to begin with, but that, my experience with some people, I'm just thinking this out loud, okay, that
Sure.
they've been through such tremendous pain, but that somewhere in their life experience, they've had enough of a whiff of, sometimes miracles happen, or sometimes some people do astonishing things, and it's just enough, even if it's this tiny, like, little vein in their coal mine of a brain, not maybe coal mine, like I'm thinking of, like, to use a geology analogy, this sort of vein of something in their strata of material, but that it's enough, kind of like the glimmer of hope, that at some point it comes back into their thinking. And so for David Goggins, at least the way he tells his story anyway, it were these motivating videos about, I think, the Navy SEALs. It was either the SEALs, that he ended up being a SEAL, but I'm not sure if that was it, or if it just started out as the Marines. But somebody, like, he saw somebody speak at his school who was, had this really cool sounding job, parachuting and doing all this stuff. So there was something like that. But I'm just saying, I don't buy. I shouldn't say that. I struggle, because I haven't done the research. I struggle to believe that it's just, it's always there as a strong mindset. But maybe we're saying the same thing. Maybe it's just something else. Somebody at some point in their life, there was this positive person or something, that even though they had all these horrendous things happen, it was enough of an awareness that at some point, when enough shit hit the fan, then I don't know, what can you, I don't know. I should even have this great insightful.
No, I appreciate your thought process and even your skepticism. But of course, that's not going to be the case for everybody. But I think it does go back to that Viktor Frankl quote. So maybe Goggins at some point, between stimulus, trauma and tragedy, and response, he had that moment of choice, and good for him, for in that moment of choice, he chose, I still have a great life to lead. Let's go lead that great life. Yeah.
And one of the other thoughts on my mind, and this has nothing to do with you actually, or even not necessarily, it does to do with the topic, but it's somebody I spoke, he also spoke at the same event I did last week. And he's someone who had a lot of professional success, and then it all collapsed, and he was over $1 million in debt. And he was drinking way too much, way too often. So he was wildly in the depths. However, this ties into your point. This supports your point. However, he'd had a different point in his, set point or experience of times where he'd had corporate and professional success. And so I think it was too unbearable at some point where he just I can't live like this anymore. I feel like the biggest loser on the planet. And then he's gone on to astonishing sales success. But I wonder about the person that doesn't have that experience in life, that positive experience, and how, whether they're people who can find fuel or the ability to change or to take traumatic stress into something positive. I'm just thinking this out loud, really. I don't expect you, but it just, because I just think because I guess part of it, because this work that I'm doing, and in some ways that we're doing, right, we want to help as many people as possible. And so I think it's nice, the more we can identify, I don't know if triggers is the right word, or, but something that resonates with people listening to this as well, so that they can say to themselves, I can do this. And even though I've had maybe this past trauma, or I've just been mildly depressed for the last 2 months, I can be another person that can take this journey. I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to think out loud.
The number one, I think, or at least where I begin when I'm coaching people, is this idea of intention, right? At some point for the rest of your life, you need to make the choice that I am going to thrive and flourish, or I'm going to continue where I'm at. You have that choice, and that's the power of choice. So I call it intention. You got to have the intention to want to change. You got to have the intention for things to get better. Yeah. And once you start with that, the future can be really bright, and the future can be really optimistic. But if you don't start with an intention that says, right now, I want it, and I want it to get better, I don't know if it's going to happen unless it's just serendipity.
Okay, so again, another kind of tough one for you here, but so here's what's going through my brain. I mean, my assumption is on New Year's Day, most people have some positive intentions for what they want. Um, and in my life experience, I'm starting to notice ever more that one of the obstacles is, I suppose, internal worth. In other words, it's one thing, like for me to wake up on New Year's Day and say, I really want to double my business this year or meet the woman of my dreams, or I shouldn't use that as an example, I'm married, but I'm just trying to think of ones that resonate with other people, or, lose 50 pounds or, have a body like such and such a person who's this great athletic person who's also 52 years old, and yet, but then the problem is too often, too quickly, and you must have experienced this in an audience. I mean, where people start to disassociate it. Well, I can't be like Don. I mean, I don't have his fill in the blank, his confidence, his work ethic, his charm, his persistence. And so then they say, therefore, ultimately they're saying, I don't know if I even deserve to see those types of outcomes. Where in your work do you address inner work?
Yeah. One, just like New Year's resolutions, people usually make 4 or 5 of them. Well, if you make 4 or 5 New Year's resolutions, you're not going to follow through on any of them. It's like a good coaching engagement. We're going to work on 1 or 2 things. So I advocate that we really, really focus on 1 or 2 different things. But we also talk about this idea of self-limiting beliefs, how we get in our own way. And we examine our self-limiting beliefs. I talk about the classic example of in the 40s and the 50s, and you, if anybody, Matt, will know this. In the 40s and 50s, medical science said that man was not meant to run the 4-minute mile. Right. But in 1954, a guy by the name of Roger Bannister not only ran the 4-minute mile, he broke the 4-minute mile. Nobody did it. And medical science said that the human body was not meant to break the 4-minute mile. He ran it in 3 minutes and 59 seconds in 1954. Broke the barrier. That's not even the best part of the story, right? The best part of the story is that 13 months after that, 7 other people broke the 4-minute barrier. They gave themselves permission. They got out of their own way, and they gave themselves permission to perform at their best. So we all have to kind of look at our beliefs and our self-limiting beliefs and go, what are my 4-minute mile barriers? What are those obstacles that I'm putting in front of myself? And we all do it. And then go, okay, let's look at this with a fresh brain. How do I overcome that? And how do I start new behaviors that gets me out of that track and into a healthier track?
That's a great example. And it's funny because that self-limiting beliefs, and that's such a meaty topic. So I'm glad we've raised the topic. Are there any other suggestions or exercises or things that you think can help people? Because I do think it's a pretty jugular subject. A little bit more time. I know we need to wrap up shortly, but what else have you found either has helped you conquer certain self-limiting beliefs, or is there an example of someone you've worked with in the past and how they kind of overcame one?
Well, we do talk about that mind, body, spirit connection. So we talk about exercise and how important exercise is to a healthy body and to a healthy brain. Exercise is the number one way to rid our bodies of cortisol. It's the number one way to build new neurons in our brain. And it also helps us create a healthy brain, because when we exercise, we have increased blood flow, which is the number one way to have a healthy brain. So we talk about brain health. We also talk about diet. Diet is really important to having our brains function at its highest capacity. And so what's good for the body is good for the brain. So we even talk about, okay, how do we improve our diet? So it's less animal protein, more vegetables, more berries, more nuts, sprinkling turmeric on our salad because it's anti-inflammatory factors, getting more sleep. Right? It's really important that we get our sleep, because the brain is still working while we sleep, and the brain is figuring out the day's problems. When we sleep, of course, we recoup and regenerate. But most people don't know this, that when we sleep and we get a good night's rest, the cerebral cortex actually opens up ever so slightly. Spinal fluid goes into the brain and cleanses the brain when we get a good night's rest. That process takes out the toxins, takes out the dead neurons, takes about 7 hours. So it's really important also that we get our sleep. And then finally, I'll say we have to get back control of our own brains. We have to get control of our own minds. How do we do that? Through understanding some very simple basic meditation techniques that gives our brain a rest, that builds new neurons, that releases certain neurotransmitters, that emboldens our immune system. Meditation is incredibly, incredibly powerful, and the research supports that. In fact, they looked at the brains of expert meditators, and they noticed that their brains were different when they studied the cadavers. they studied their brains. Their hippocampi were larger in the brains of meditators. So it's not just something that comes from, say, Eastern religions and it's some far out thing. It actually helps us be healthier, gives us a healthier brain, a healthier outlook. So if we do all of these things and we have the intention to get better, and we don't continue down the neural pathway that is a negative default, and we develop a new neural pathway that is a positive default, we're going to be different and better.
Okay, one last question, maybe not the easiest, but I think I remember this from one of the Martin Seligman books, but he talks about how sort of we may all have different sort of set points of happiness. In other words, some people may just genetically and be ultimately going to have or live at a somewhat happier level than other people, because maybe it's, I don't know, it's enough of a stretch for people to go, I'm just making these numbers up, but to say to go from typically feeling like a 4 out of 10 on the happiness to a 7, that they're, but have you run across that, or can you speak to that, or is that even true anymore? Because I mean, it was probably written in a book 10, 15 years ago or more.
Yeah, that's based at Seligman. That is based on the work of Barbara Fredrickson, who was at the University of Michigan, and I think she's at the University of Carolina right now. And they did some extensive studies actually studying twins, twins that were separated at birth. And they were able to determine that there is kind of this genetic factor in our happiness set point. And I forget what it was, but the number that I do remember is that our happiness set point we can move, and that's 40%. 40% of our happiness we still have control over. And I think the other, what would it be, 50% was genetic. We kind of genetically are at a certain set point. And then 10%, only 10% is our environment. The big number there, the important number there, Matt, is that 40%. Right. That based on our thoughts, based on our beliefs, based on our behaviors, we still have a 40% where we can affect our happiness.
Interesting. Yeah. No,
let me make a final point about that one.
Yeah.
Because, so we have a happiness set point, right? And what's really interesting is that it's called hedonic. Well, never mind. We're going to erase this one because I was going to go down a long track.
Okay. No, that's fine. I mean, it never hurts to know there's more info on. I'm sure there's way more on this topic we could discuss too, in general, because it's such a fascinating and jugular one, really. But we have covered many different areas. I think, I didn't expect to talk as much about the physical piece, but of course, as you say, it's all connected to our brain. So it's nice to have some specific things that can make such a difference there, as you said, from seemingly ordinary things like sleep and meditation's hardly ordinary or common practice, but it's always good to be reminded about how valuable that is. So I guess, so wrapping up, the last question I have for you would be, I suppose, since you shifted since your workaholic days, who would you say you've become as a person?
Yeah, really a model and a manifestation of that which I teach and that which I talk about, in terms of diet, exercise, meditation, reframing when I catch myself ruminating, hanging out with really positive people. Yeah, I think I've become kind of the living and breathing model for what I teach. Like I said, this is really a fascinating kind of anecdote that when I was under so much stress and when I was working those long hours, again, I was getting sick every quarter. Since I've been doing this, I haven't been sick once.
No, and as we both know, I think it's not an anecdote, really, is it? It's more than coincidence. So love it. Thank you, Don. This has been fantastic. Really, lots of meat, and also lots of practical things that we talked about too. You know, like the gratitude practice, and you know, catching our thinking, the reframing. I mean, some of these things are things that we can implement, frankly, immediately. I guess I will ask then, I mean, are there any other kind of easy to implement strategies that are worth mentioning, or do you feel like you've covered the main ones?
Well, there's many that have an effect, right? There's a spiritual aspect, learning to forgive people. But one that's really key, and it's a little bit like exercise. I know that when I exercise and I have a partner, or we're going to go for a run, knowing that I'm going to meet that partner at the corner, that makes me get out there and do it, right? The fact that somebody else is involved. So I think this does not have to be a solo journey. And if you have a life partner, a spouse, a friend, who you can also do this with and share your successes and share your challenges, share your research. I think that is really powerful to help you be consistent and stay on your path, because as we all know, it's so easy to come off of the path and go back to our old habits. I think if you have a partner, it's easier to stay on the path.
Yeah, no, that's been my life experience as well. So, well, very good. Well, thank you, Don, so much for your time. Really appreciate it. How can listeners keep in touch with you or kind of find out more about what you're working on?
Sure. I'd love it if they go to my website, gopositive.com. Note that it's go positive without the E. Yeah. Just go to the website, and they can even send me an email through the website.
Okay. And then what kind of, I guess, services, resources? You mentioned that you do workshops. How else do you help other people? Yeah, we do workshops called Positive Performance. We also do one that's positive leadership. We also do positive emotional intelligence. We do coaching, and we do keynotes, and I love doing them all. So please reach out, even if it's just to ask about some of the studies. I'd be happy to talk to anybody. Yeah, awesome. Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you so much, Don. Those of you that listened, appreciate you spending time on this. I would be staggered if you didn't find something useful in it. Certainly hope you did. So thanks for that. Thanks. Also, don't forget, if you haven't subscribed yet to the podcast, please do. If you have interest in masterminds that I'm running, please let me know. And then otherwise, I always like to wrap up the road rarely taken with my favorite question, which was, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? I'm Matt Anderson, and as I said, this was the road rarely taken.